welcome to BloombergQuint. We're heading into another budget, but a particularly difficult one, not just difficult to frame, difficult to discuss as well. There are a bunch of cross currents that we are hoping to talk about. One, of course, is that on the headline, you may be seeing some recovery in the economy, but everyone recognizes that there are vast swaths that may still need support from government spending. That will need to be juxtaposed against what will be another reset of fiscal rules. Helping us speak through some of this or think through some of this is Dr. Indira Rajaraman. She's kindly agreed to join us today. Ma'am, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ma'am, I'll start with actually your view of what you've made of all the incoming macro data before I dive into the fiscal reset. It certainly seems like at the headline formal sector level, the economy is improving, and some could even say improving a little bit quicker, despite us continuing to live in virus times. Yet, other indicators such as, say, the elevated demand for Manrega tell us that there is still stress very much in the economy. How are you framing the macroeconomic backdrop to this budget?
Well, I'm not as enthused by the headline figures as some other people seem to be, maybe because they were expecting worse performance than what we have. But if you notice, the second half of the year is expected to grow just a touch above zero. And that is why the whole year is, averaging out to 7.7% after that 15.7% decline in the first half. I was hoping for a better performance. And why was I hoping for that? The reason is that I've been tracking e-way bills. And e-way bills have, in the last month, climbed above 60 million in a month, which is very good. It was always hovering, the best performance was always hovering around 50 million. So that seemed to me to be a good indicator of movement of cargo by road, which is one of the arteries through which the economy gets back to normal. And of course, the GST performance has been very good. So altogether, I was hoping for slightly better numbers than what we did in fact get.
Okay, so the government, as it frames the budget, will be mindful of the fact that, while we will see very high growth rates in the next year, that hides still pain in certain parts of the economy. And hence, as it starts to reset its fiscal roadmap, it would have to do so with caution.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, if I were to prescribe an approach for the coming fiscal year, what I would recommend is a budget estimate for the year on the 1st of February, which will carry with it a formal provision that at the end of November, when the first 2 quarter results are in for the forthcoming fiscal year, there will be a reset of the budget estimates, both in terms of the overall deficit projected, as well as the constituents of expenditure, depending on which sectors are leaping up better in the first 2 quarters than in others. So I think the time now is not for a single year, beginning of the year setting of the fiscal deficit, but for a piecewise approach with a rethink after every 6 months.
That would be for, say, this year and perhaps next year, you would say, as opposed to sort of moving into a range-like scenario for the fiscal deficit, which some say the Commission has suggested.
Well, the 15th Finance Commission suggested a range because they were still thinking in terms of a single deficit at the beginning of the year. And that's a good idea. I mean, I think the idea of having a fixed target has not worked very well for us because what it has meant is that there has been an attempt to stick to the target no matter what. A lot of expenditure swept under the carpet. I've written about this. Payments delayed. And those have had a devastating impact both on the real economy and on the financial economy. Think of ILFS, think of many other instances of where contractors were not paid simply because of the binding fiscal deficit target. So a range is a very good thing, but I think that it wouldn't hurt for the start of the budget year to have a fixed target, which will be re-examined after 6 months and adjusted within the range, so that there is a sense that there is a hand driving that the economy is being driven with a careful watch on the traffic and a willingness to change course if need be.
Okay, that's very interesting. the broader fiscal rules, which will also need to be reset this year, ma'am, I think, and I'll draw from that article that you were speaking about in the context of infrastructure. But you said that the FRBM has essentially become a statement of aspirational intent, which is true, right? I mean, year after year, reset after reset, we have chased that 3% target, and sort of probably met it more in letter than in spirit in many years.
Right, absolutely. In fact, now that all observers and all advisors agree that the fiscal gate should be open, I think the time has now come for the government to pay back all past dues, declare, start from a clean slate, and declare that going forward, not more than 5 or 10 working days will elapse between the approval of a particular stretch of work on a highway or a particular purchase and the actual payment to the contractor. I think that will do a great deal to restore fiscal transparency and credibility within the system.
Okay, ma'am, but how do we approach the next fiscal reset, in the sense that is there going to be a rethink on whether that 3% target has become outdated, given the way sort of global thinking has moved as well, or is there still, I mean, if one looks at it from the broader perspective, we do still need to reduce our fiscal deficit. There's no doubt about that, our revenue deficit, etc. So is there a wider rethink that you think is likely or possible at this stage?
Yes, definitely. I think a wider rethink is necessary. 3% is a hook on which we hung our hats for a time. It was something we got from the Maastricht Treaty. There's nothing necessarily sacrosanct about it. So after the 2 years that we're now going to see, where I'm recommending 6 monthly resets, after that, we will be in a good position to identify or quantify a very, very important parameter which governs fiscal consolidation. And that is the nominal rate of growth that we can confidently foresee. If you remember, the FRBM committee was going with a nominal growth rate of 11.5%. That unfortunately became a joke soon after, because the economy was declining for 8 straight quarters before COVID already. But after 2 years, if we can see ourselves being able to project confidently a nominal growth rate, annual growth rate of 11.5%, let's say, going back to the FRBM, that then gives us a parameter on the basis of which we can specify our long-term debt to GDP target and map back from that to the fiscal deficit target, which will get us there in the long run. So the first thing that we have to do is to get real growth rate going, without at the same time, letting loose inflation. Inflation is already at the 7% mark, headline inflation. So we want to up our real growth rate while still keeping inflation under control, get to a point where we can say, all right, now we can see ourselves to having nominal growth at 11.5 or 11 or 12, whatever. At a certain point, we fix that. We fix that as not just aspirational, but achievable. And then going from there, we have that parameter in hand. We then look at the long-term debt GDP target that we think is good for us. And we map back from that onto the fiscal deficit, which will, in a steady state, deliver us to that eventual debt GDP target. I think that will be the way by which we have to think about it and move towards it.
The long-term debt GDP target, which had been put down by the previous committee, the FRBM review committee, was 60%. I mean, we'll close this year somewhere close to 85 or so.
Right.
So, needless to say, that path to 60% may get elongated. But does that 60% also sort of need to be rethought, given the global rethink that we're seeing, ma'am?
Very definitely. 60%, it was justified by calculations which I challenged when I wrote about the committee report. I don't think we need to be that ambitious. I think 70% would do just as well. And with a high nominal growth rate, that wouldn't even require that punishing a fiscal deficit. Remember, at the end of the day, we are still a country with children who are being stunted and wasted for lack of nutrition. And that calls for revenue expenditure, not capital expenditure. Then we need capital expenditure. We are a country with unpaved roads, with bridges which are falling down, with buildings in Bombay which are collapsing. So there are a number of directions in which expenditure is not just desirable, but essential. We need not tie ourselves down with a 60% debt to GDP ratio especially since that is not going to get us any enhanced virtue in the eyes of financial markets. It's just a number. We can choose 70%. We can choose 75% for that matter. As long as financial markets are convinced that the authorities who are driving this Indian economy have the economy well in hand, that they're watching inflation, they're watching real growth, they're responding to the need of the hour, and they have a nominal growth rate target that they think is feasible and achievable, and are mapping back from their debt target, which may be high at 75% to GDP, but then on the other hand, they're working systematically towards it. That's what financial markets want. They want steadiness. They want a steady hand at the controls of the economy.
Okay. One last question on this aspect, and then I want to talk to you about spending priorities. I think Long suggested, Fiscal Council. I just feel, do you think that at this stage, given that we have a monetary policy committee, which is, sort of a committee independent, it just needs to be counterbalanced with that independent Fiscal Council more than ever?
I have not been in favor of a fiscal council, although I was a member of the 13th Finance Commission, which recommended it. I did not go along with that decision, but then I didn't dispute it either. There's a very important reason why I don't favor a fiscal council. You have to remember that in order for a fiscal council to function, like, let's say, the Office of Management and Budget in the United States, which is probably what everyone is thinking about. The government needs, this council would need to have all the projected and committed expenditures of every department of the government in hand for them to be able to project overall expenditure. Now, for this, they would need close data cooperation from the Ministry of Finance and indeed from all ministries in the central government, in the state government, especially if it's a national fiscal council. There are a lot of turf wars within government. In fact, within the Ministry of Finance, it's no secret that there are turf wars between the CBDT and the CBEC. Now, can you really see the government and departments of the government collaborating with this fiscal council, giving them the data, when they know fully well that the council is going to sit in judgment over them? They're not going to collaborate. The fiscal council is not going to be able to get the data. And without those data, they cannot do anything. Revenue projections are relatively simple. Once you have a nominal growth rate, you can simulate various buoyancies and you can have a variety of scenarios, and that can be done within a day. Expenditure is another matter. So I don't think a fiscal council will work in India. Remember, we have a competition commission in India, which has been in place for 10, 15 years. They haven't been able to get a single case through the court system in India. Now, of course, that's a different problem. It has to do with the judicial system. But I think the fiscal council will not resolve anything. It will only complicate things. It will make for turf warfare within government. I don't think it will get us anywhere.
All right, that's a realistic view, which allows me to, sort of move into another realistic view, which you wrote about. Amid all of this talk about where should the government spend, I think the one thing that everybody went to was, Keynesian public work spend on infrastructure from the government end. I think you detailed a slightly different view. Perhaps theoretically, yes, spend on infrastructure, but the realistic situation in India suggests otherwise.
Well, no, I fully agree that infrastructure expenditure is something we need. And this is something that is going to take care both of the supply side in terms of giving us more infrastructure and the demand side, wages to workers on the infrastructure projects. The only thing I was sounding a cautionary note on was that the government's own reports on the status of infrastructure projects show that 70% of all major infrastructure projects, that is to say projects with a value of more than 150 crore, lie incomplete, and that the delay between the time of the projected time of completion and the actual time of completion is roughly of the order of 3.5 years. Now just think about it. We're a poor country. Fiscal resources are scarce. You're spending this on an infrastructure project, let's say in power, roads, or irrigation, which is lying incomplete. It's therefore useless. It's not, as an incomplete project, it's not adding to the productive capacity of the economy at all. Therefore, it's an infructuous expenditure until it is completed and commissioned. So when you have this kind of situation, My recommendation was, don't take on additional infrastructure projects. Finish what you have in hand so that the past expenditure, you can, the benefit of that can be reaped today. Just think about it. All the past years, the taxpayer of India has been forking out money, which has been going out into these infrastructure projects, which are lying there massively incomplete. Just think of the waste. If we could just finish those, whatever they are, irrigation, power, roads, they would be commissioned, they would be functioning, they would add to the productive capacity of the economy. So my recommendation was not to turn our backs on infrastructure, but to turn our attention sensibly to infrastructure. Look at incomplete projects and finish them.
And also, once again, as you said earlier in the interview, clear out all the payments to contractors, etc. That just, I mean, seems like a no-brainer.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Is there merit, ma'am, in the argument that you need to spend more on social safety net programs, for the want of a better word? I mean, certainly Manrega this year has helped to a large extent. I think we're already ending, budgets at about 82,000 crore having been spent. Would next year need not just spending on that, but perhaps some have suggested some sort of an urban jobs guarantee? Is there any reason to think about that?
No, I'm not in general in favor of an urban jobs guarantee. The reason being that, Manrega is in the nature of a marginal payment to tide workers over into a state of better nutrition and more food, with other basic expenditures like a place to live and so on provided, which you have only in rural areas. In urban areas, this jobs guarantee is not going to give people enough money with which to pay their rent. What it'll do is to give a jobs top up to people who are already resident there, let's say to the family members of those people. But unless the infrastructure is actually meaningful in urban areas, it's going to be very wasteful. No one talks about it, but a lot of Manrega expenditure also goes into largely wasteful infrastructure expenditure. But we don't look at that so much because we're looking more at the income supplement aspect of it. So it's really a workfare program. We're not interested that much in the productivity of the work. We're more interested in the welfare part of it. So I'd say that Manrega should stay rural. That's where it's really working well. And I'd say, yes, by all means, let's give it a funds boost. And that can be used to build up new agricultural marketplaces and therefore dovetail in with these farmer protests and so on. Because once the new marketplaces are built and ready and functioning, then to have non-monopolistic traders come in and buy becomes that much more possible and feasible.
So apart from what I've asked, infrastructure and some of these social security programs, what do you think should be spending priorities? I haven't specifically asked about the vaccine because it's unclear as to how much they need to spend. Obviously, that would be one priority. But what do you think are spending priorities this year?
I'm actually going to speak about the vaccines because, of course, it's a spending priority. But the question is, what should our focus be? I remember earlier I spoke about the e-way bills. Because they were an indicator that cargo movement is taking off and is really going well. What we need now is to ensure that people can also move freely, which will be enabled only if you have a very widespread vaccination program. In particular, in addition to health workers, I think there also has to be a focus on not just police, but drivers of road vehicles and rail vehicles, because that will lift some of the pressure off these people who are doing risky things when they drive across the country or they drive a train across the country. So all operators of transport vehicles of both passengers and goods, if they are vaccinated on an emergency basis, that will do a lot for the mobility that we need in order to get the economy humming again. And so that is where I would like to see the greatest, emphasis or added emphasis in the first, group of people who will be given, the free vaccine. But in terms of other things, we've talked about infrastructure, we've talked about vaccination. I think we need a big boost for nutrition expenditures, food and nutrition, especially for children of poor families. Let us recall that during this whole unfortunate COVID period, the ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, which operates all those Anganwadis where expectant and lactating mothers and infants are given food supplements, they've been closed. That nutrition has been deprived to a very, very vulnerable segment of our population. Of course, we did have in the Garib Kalyan Yojana, we did have a huge ramp up. I was very proud of that in the PDS. But there are many poor households who don't have access to a ration card. So this denial of food to infants and expectant mothers has been devastating in terms of the potential impact it could have on the nutritional status of these families, of these children. Then remember that the midday meal scheme in schools was also not taking off. So school-going children were being denied this external nutrition flow. Once again, replaced to some extent by that household PDS entitlement, but not fully, and not as fully as the universe of children going to school because their parents may not have a ration card, especially in urban areas. So when you take all this together, the urgency of restoring food and nutrition to preschool and school children becomes paramount. When schools open, we need to focus a lot more on the food that they're going to be getting, even more than the resumption of classroom education. Particularly since from Pratham surveys, we learned that schools, teachers have been doing a lot to reach education to children in villages and so on. So it's been very heartening. But the food wasn't reaching them because the midday meal kitchens weren't functioning. So food, nutrition, especially in view of the NFHS 5 data, that stunting and wasting among children has actually worsened over the recent years. And this was in 2019-20 before COVID. So that is extremely important. Now, how can that be dovetailed in with other requirements that we have in the economy? Well, if midday meals and food in Anganwadis is sourced from local farmers and the local crops that are grown, then it's going to dovetail into enhanced farmer incomes, especially if they are thereby given this assurance that their output is going to be bought and fed straight to children. After all, historically, what did children and mothers eat? They ate locally produced foods. We didn't have a national food market. So we need to restore that link between local farm produce and feeding of children, and then we can achieve these twin objectives of getting economic growth going in the farm sector and also lowering the malnutrition among our children, which is extremely worrying. Lastly, in terms of expenditure imperatives, we need to focus on the financial sector. Particularly, I think the government should fund the setting up of a bad bank. There is a lot of research, particularly from the RBI recent working paper, which shows that it is the albatross of bad loans around the necks of these banks, which is really preventing fresh flow of credit. Despite everything that the RBI has been doing in the form of targeted long-term repo operations and whatnot, in order to get credit flowing again. I know that the bad bank has been opposed by a number of people, including Raghuram Rajan when he was here, but I think the time has come. And the reason the time has come is because even though we have ATRs, ARCs, asset reconstruction companies, there's always a pricing issue which dominates in terms of the offloading of a bad loan onto an ARC. There is a suspicion that this pricing is not arm's length. Whereas if you have a bad bank, which acts like an umbrella over all banks and is not owned by a particular bank or a particular set of banks like ARCs often are, then I think the pricing is likely to be less suspect, and the bad bank is also in a better position to build up those assets and realize a profit on them. So I think the time has come for a bad bank. Rather than for recapitalization of banks, I still think a bad bank is a better bet in terms of where the government's money should go.
That's very interesting. You think the government should dive in, although I think one of the biggest questions has been, do you end up politicizing,
Yes.
The whole bad loans
Yes.
issue? What do you buy? What price you buy it? But I guess, somebody has to bite the bullet there.
It's better to have a bad bank which is set up set up with some barriers between that and the political class, and then have them decide on pricing of assets across banks, and not just like ARCs, which focus on particular banks because they are owned by the banks themselves.
My last question, ma'am, actually does come back a little bit to Bombay. We spoke a lot about fiscal policy and whether they choose to keep it mildly expansionary. We'll find out. But they will they have to be mindful of the fact that monetary policy will need to start returning to a steady state next year, and not just interest rates, which will perhaps be determined by how inflation plays out. But certainly, there's a lot of angst about the kind of liquidity that has been sloshing in the system, the mispricing of risk, even if not fueling of excess credit. So fiscal policy will have to be mindful of the fact that the extraordinary support to government borrowings from the monetary policy side will perhaps not remain next year.
Absolutely. I don't think we can allow the present liquidity situation to continue for the even for the next year, let alone beyond that. So there has to be some correction. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm not too worried about that. I think the RBI has been very watchful of the liquidity situation, has been mindful of the dangers of continuing this for an indefinite period of time. What I'm more worried about is banking regulation by the RBI. You know that our RBI is a full-service central bank. It does everything, including banking regulation. And there have been a number of missteps. In fact, if you ask people in general, are you confident in the RBI? There is some confidence lacking in the banking regulatory aspect of the Reserve Bank. And although people don't separate regulation and supervision in their minds, I think banking supervision has left a lot to be desired.
Oh, absolutely. Ma'am, I'll leave it at that. Absolutely great speaking to you. Very kind of you to spare time for us here on BloombergQuint.
Thank you, Ida.
Thank you for watching Bloomberg.